Okay, this is Joseph Lebrec, and I'm going to go through and talk a little bit about Starling and how to set up a Starling project inside of Flash Builder. So, if you need to grab Starling or check out the documentation or anything like that, you can get there through gamua.com/Starling. And this will take you to a page that lets you download Starling as a SWIC, which you can then use in any project, and it also provides help. You've got an overview of the framework. It's free and open source, platform independent, all this stuff. So if we go to help, we can see that there's a first steps guide here. There's an API reference. There's a wiki. There's a forum. So there's lots of different ways to get help with Starling. So here's Flash Builder 4.7. And what I'm going to do is right-click within my Package Explorer and click Import. Go to Flash Builder. I want to import a Flash Builder project. Hit Next. And I'm going to import from a project folder. I'm going to browse to the folder, which is Starling Starter right here. And this is just a group of files that I've created as sort of a template project for getting started with Starling. So hit Finish. And it'll import all of these files to our workspace and create a project for us. So now that we have our project defined, we can see that it's actually targeting Flash Player here. Here's our Air SDK that Flash Builder is using. Here's our debug folder. So anytime we build out and test using run or debug, a SWIF will be created within our debug folder. Reference libraries, we have starling.swic, and we want to just go in here, right click, go to properties, and then go into action script build path to make sure that we're pointing at starling.swic. So this is the SWIC that you can download from that Starling website. So we can edit this if we need to. So right now it's referring to our source folder, Starling SWIC. And if we look, there's our source folder, there's Starling SWIC. And if it didn't show up, we'd actually have a bunch of errors coming out in our problems pane, and also indicated through the icons here. So you'll notice a few different things we have in our default package. We've got this embedded assets class, we have a game class, and our default class here is simplestarlinggame.as. So let's open that one up first. You can do that just by double clicking on it. And we can see that we've got a package here. If you're not familiar with some of the stuff that's going on inside Flash Builder, this is basically our document class. So if we were doing this inside of Flash Professional, we could create a blank FLA file and then just point to this class here, simplestarlinggame.as, as our document class. So you can use these templates. You can use Starling in both Flash Professional and in Flash Builder, or Flash Develop, or FDT, or IntelliJ, anything that you would desire. So here we're importing flash.display.sprite because this first class has to extend sprite. But then we're also importing starling.core.starling and starling.events.event. So this is going to bring libraries from within this package that we have right here. These are just different classes from our Starling framework. Here we have a Swift meta tag. So this goes through and defines the width, height, frame rate, and background color of our movie. And we also have our constructor class here. So constructor class, of course, has to be named the same thing as our package, which is the same thing as our file name. So simple Starling game, file, simple Starling game, class, and simple Starling game constructor function. And all we're doing in this constructor function is adding an event listener of type event added to stage, which is coming, of course, from starling.events.event. And when this is actually added to the stage, we're going to invoke this function onAddedToStage. So our onAddedToStage function we're going to remove that event listener that we just created because we don't need it anymore. It's only going to be added to the stage once, and we want to clean up after ourselves so we don't have things using memory that don't need to. And then there's a few different things we can set here. We're setting Starling.multitouch enabled to true and Starling.handle lost context to true. You don't have to set these, but you know, they do some nice things. Multi-touch enabled will enable multi-touch if the device is capable of using it, and handle lost context is going to allow us to create, to react to when the context is lost and so forth. So these are two that you should probably have in there. Whether you define them true or false, that's up to you. We also create our Starling object. So up here we have a private variable mStarling, and that's a Starling object. So this is when we actually create the Starling view. So here's mStarling. It's set equal to a new Starling, and we pass in the class that's going to represent our game. So here it's just called game, and you can see that there's our class right there, game, and we'll look at that in a moment. And then we have to pass in, well, the context for this, well, the stage. So we can just say this stage or stage to pass in the current stage to the Starling game function. And then we can say, again, simulate multi-touch if we want to. Actually simulate multi-touch. There's some mechanisms for that within Starling. And then Starling start. If you want to pare it down to the very basics, this is really all you need for it to function correctly. There are, of course, other things like Starling statistics and things like that that we can add, but we don't necessarily need them. So let's go into our game class, which is what is being created as our first Starling view. And you'll notice that this game class extends sprite, and it's not the normal flash.display.sprite, it's actually starling.display.sprite. So with Starling, a lot of the different classes that we would traditionally use from Flash packages, they have an equivalent within these Starling packages. So we have to keep that in mind as we're working in Starling. So here we just create our assets manager. And let's go into the assets manager right now. The class we're using with our assets manager is this embedded assets class. And there's only one thing in here right now. We're embedding this startup JPEG right here. So you can see here's the JPEG file. We're embedding that and giving it a public static constant name of startup. So we'll be able to invoke this later. But here's where we set up our asset manager. Asset manager is a special type of utility class within Starling that allows us to access different assets in a uniform way. So inside of our game class, our game function, this is our constructor function. We're setting assets equal to a new asset manager instance. And then we're going to invoke enqueue and pass in embedded assets. So this is passing in this class right here. When it enqueues them, it's going to go through and actually, bring them all in and actually make them available for us. We load queue, and then we check here ratio. It's basically a progress loader. If that ratio is equal to 1, meaning everything's loaded up, then we invoke start game. Here's our start game function. And here's really the meat of what's going to happen in a project like this, because we've set up Starling at this point. It's running. We have access to any of the assets that we've created. So now we can actually code whatever the experience is we're doing, the game or whatever. So here we invoke some different functions like setup background. Setup background is going to just go through, create a new texture, and it's going to grab that texture from our assets manager through get texture startup. Now if we go back to embedded assets, we can see there's startup right there. So it's actually, when you want to grab this particular JPEG as a texture, you just use that name that we've given it. So startup. It's pretty easy. Then we're creating a new image called startup image as a new image, and we pass in that texture that we just created. And then to actually see any of this stuff, of course, we have to add child. So that's adding it to our Starling view. So startup image. At this point, this background image is going to be available for us to see on our actual Swift when we compile it. We can also set up player, set up collectibles, set up listeners, and these are just examples of things you might want to do. So here, set up player, it's just stubbed out, there's nothing in there yet, but here you could create your player object as a sprite or an image or whatever, and actually have that thing move around on the stage and so forth. It could extend some other class if you wanted to, but to keep it simple, you could always even just draw out a little rectangle or a circle and just have that respond to keyboard events. Set up collectibles, same thing. If you wanted to create a bunch of different objects for the player to move around and pick up, you could create them all right here. Set up listeners. So here you can see we've actually got a little guy stubbed out for a keyboard event listener on key down, which we invoke this right here. So at this point, it's just all normal kind of ActionScript logic going on, because Starling itself and the Starling view has been created for us through the use of Simple Starling game, and embedded assets. So when we actually go and run this, it compiles for us, and you can see that indeed that background image did come in and has been added to the display view of Starling and so forth. So our game is, or at least the foundation of our game exists, it's there, it's ready for us to build logic upon.